Thank you, David, first of all. It's a delight to be here. David just mentioned that I travelled from South Wales. This is no hardship for me because, as some of you, I know a few of the faces in the audience, most of you are unknown to me, but as a few know, I do have strong London connections. I'm the son of Welsh artists, lived in London until I was 12. The family moved back to Wales then, but I couldn't resist the great attractions of London and came back and did my first degree, again, as David mentioned, here at UCL. So it's a delight for me to be back in the city. It's also a surprise because this is my first time in Highgate School, so that's an extra pleasure, and given the Welsh connection with Kyffin. So I wanted to begin with that title slide up there, the view from the south. So you can interpret that in a number of ways, can't you, the south? So it could be us here in the south, it could be me in South Wales. 3 of the 4 artists that I'm looking at were born in the south of Wales, one in the north, who of course is Kyffin. A few other thanks before I sort of get fully underway is I'd like to thank the National Library of Wales based in Aberystwyth. If you've never been there, go. It is superb. The title would suggest that it's the depository of the books of Wales in both languages, but it has a very impressive art collection, and over many years it's put on very impressive art exhibitions of Welsh artists in its Gregunog gallery, which is a kind of key word, Gregunog, which I will just tantalise you with the word. The other people I'd like to thank are the estates of 3 of the artists. So the National Library, Kyffin had no children, so the National Library owns the copyright for images of Kyffin. So I'd like to thank them for providing me with some images, also with a few images by Bernard Mitchell. Let's see. So here we have 4 photographs by Bernard Mitchell. Bernard Mitchell is a living photographer based in Wales. He's in his 70s, and his mission since the 60s, when he was a student, has been to record visually on film. And it really was film originally, now it's digital, it's virtual. The artists, poets, musicians and writers, painters, sculptors of Wales. So these are my 4 subjects. So thank you to the National Library, to Bernard Mitchell, and to the 3 estates of the other 3 artists. So you obviously can recognise Kyffin there, top left. Top right, we have Joan Baker. Bottom left, we have Ogwyn Davies. And bottom right, we have Ernest Saboli. So thank you to the estates also for the use of images. The other key resource I've used, and I'm sure many of you use it as well, and if you don't, please do, Art UK. It began as BBC Your Paintings, but it's now Art UK. Its initial mission, as the title suggests, was to record all the paintings. Can you believe this? All the paintings in public collections in the whole of the UK. But it's actually broadened that mission since, and it's now looking at sculpture, and it will look at works on paper. So it's renamed as Art UK. So thank you to them. Do use that resource. Lastly, thank you to Alolva, who are the publishers of my book on Ogwyn Davies, who, as I said, is there in his patriotic red smock, looking out of the window in mid-Wales. Thank you to Alolva. I've written several books over the years now, as well as lots of articles on Welsh artists, but this is the first one that is bilingual. So it's in the 2 languages of Wales. Okay, so to tell you a bit more about our 4 subjects, Kyffin was born in 1918, and all 4 artists are born within 9 years of each other. And I hadn't realised, but there's a beautiful, David, you'll appreciate this as a mathematician, there's a beautiful arrangement here. You'll see what I mean. Kyffin born in 1918, Joan Baker in 1922, so you have a gap of 4 years. And then Ogwyn born in 1925, so you have a gap of 3 years. And then Saboli born in 1927, so you have a gap of 2 years. So there's 4, 3 and 2 years between them all, which I thought was mathematically pleasing. Coming back to the art, Kyffin essentially is associated with North Wales. He's North Wales born. And although he did do portraits, I'm going to primarily concentrate on his work as a landscapist. So it will be the mountains, particularly Snowdonia, that we associate Kyffin with. Which, of course, as the subtitle of my talk is Painters of Wales. I mean, in a sense, Kyffin's Wales to short circuit, if you like, is Snowdonia. It is the north. It's the kind of heartland. Eryri in Welsh. Joan Baker, top right there. She was born in South Wales, born in Cardiff. She actually died in the house she was born in, which I think is absolutely amazing. I'd quite like to do that, but it's not going to happen because I was born in London and I live in Wales. She, like Kyffin, did occasionally deal with the figure, but I'm going to concentrate on her as a landscapist as well, Painters of Wales. But her primary obsession was the coast. So we go from mountainous North Wales with Kyffin, and that's him in his studio on Anglesey, to Joan in coastal South Wales, that's in her studio in Cardiff. And then we come to Ogwyn. Now Ogwyn is the transitional one, so in a sense we are going to be covering the whole of Wales, because although Ogwyn was born in the south, in the upper Swansea Valley, he moved to mid Wales. So there he is in mid Wales in Tregaron, which was essentially rural. So already we now have mountainous Wales, we have coastal Wales, and we have rural. And the last artist, bottom right, Ernest Zaboli. Now that name, I did study Italian with history of art, so an Italian would pronounce the name Zobole, but known as Zaboli. He was of Italian parentage, so he was genetically Italian, but as probably you know, with migration, economic migrants, we know all about that now, don't we? His parents came over to South Wales as teenagers to work from southern Italy. And then he was one of 6 children that were born in the South Wales coalfield, which really was a kind of gold rush, except the gold was black. This coal is sometimes known as black gold. So he is from a different kind of Wales again, which is urbanised Wales, and he's also in his studio. I mean, there are lots of things I could dwell on, I won't, but if you notice that Ernie's decided, he was known as Ernest, probably christened Ernesto. His brother was certainly christened Luigi, but known as Louis, so you know the anglicisation of the Italian. But he's painted his floorboards white, and his easel is actually painted white. I mean, you can see where it's worn off, where he stood in front of the easel to work. So these are the 4. I couldn't resist, could I? Given we're in Highgate School, I thought I'd start, even though I'm primarily talking about landscape, not exclusively, I thought I'd start with Kyffin's Highgate Schoolboy on the left there, and more or less at the same period, an image of a girl by Joan Baker. So what I want to do here, no one has done this before, in Kyffin in a sense is the kind of archetype or even the caricature of the Welsh artist in many ways. You know, he is the name. And I still think, even though there have been various biographies now, I don't think we've yet discovered the real and full Kyffin, if one ever can. So there's a lot more to do, but I thought it would be useful. I found it fascinating to do this. By the way, I've met all 4 artists, so I had direct contact with them all. It would be interesting to perhaps consider Kyffin in relation to Joan Baker. So in a sense, I call it the kind of yin and yang aspects of Wales. You have Kyffin in the north, Joan in the south. Kyffin is the male, Joan is the female. Both trained during World War II. Joan in Cardiff Art School, and she related a wonderful story of how she was forced to wear trousers in order to do fire watching, which incidentally Kerry Richards did in Cardiff in the war, because they were considered safer than dresses. But she said, I hated them, they were woolly and itchy. And that conversation arose out of me asking her, we saw her in skirts, and that was it. She got put off trousers in Cardiff. So she went to Cardiff Art School at 16 on a scholarship. Kyffin was that little bit older and, of course, went to the Slade, but being the war, it was evacuated out to Oxford. So in the sense, they both trained at the same period in different places. Both came from professional backgrounds. You could almost describe Kyffin possibly as upper middle class, but certainly, you know, there was a gentry connections. And Joan came from the middle class. I think those things are relevant because, again, we'll have images, I'm sure, as I'm talking, you do, of what Welsh people come from, what kind of group, what kind of social class, what kind of professions. But our first 2 artists, Kyffin and Joan, were not from the working class, and I think that partly informs some of the work. I mean, you know, Highgate School isn't your average school, is it, after all? Which is where Kyffin comes to after studying. But yeah, I do see them as kind of opposites. Kyffin concentrates on look at the backgrounds, on the dark, and Joan concentrates on the light, both literally and metaphorically. Okay, so to sort of move into them as landscapists, these are two, again, early examples. So as I say, I'm not in every slide, but I am overall juxtaposing Williams and Baker. So on the left here we have an image of Eryri, which of course is the Welsh word for Snowdonia, in a kind of typical kind of Kyffin manner. And then on the right, I mean, she's not very well known even now, Joan Baker. This is fairly typical of her work, of someone called Miss Cotton. You can see the dates are almost the same. Both these works are acquired by the Glyn Vivian Art Gallery in Swansea when they're still quite young artists. So they are beginning to emerge. And again, a lot easier in a way for Kyffin as a male than for Joan as a female. They were beginning to emerge in that immediate post-war period, the period of the Attlee government, and the time when things were beginning to open up after the war and there were new possibilities. What you may or may not have noticed, if you look really carefully, you can see that in Eryri, if you look really hard on the right-hand side of the picture, can you see the waving path? Sorry, I should have asked, can you hear me all right at the back? Yeah. There is a figure, a lone figure walking. So it's a figure, it's a landscape with a figure. Yeah, it is. It's very shadowy, but on the path there is a solitary figure, a male figure walking away from us. Obviously, in the case of the Joan painting, the figure is foregrounded. Both these paintings probably resulted from holidays. I mean, Kyffin, as you probably heard sometimes when he was here at Highgate, because he would have been teaching here when he painted that, you know, he would disappear, ideally in the holidays, but sometimes in term time, to go and commune with his beloved Snowdonia. So that solitary figure could be a kind of self-portrait. I think there are even echoes of Van Gogh, and I think Kyffin, there's kind of an association to a certain extent with Van Gogh. The vigorous brushwork, which it is brushwork first before he uses the palette knife, the lone figure, the tendency towards depression, there are some other issues as well. In the case of Joan, it's much more luminous, and this again is a holiday painting. She told me that she was on holiday with her parents in the southwest of England, and they went into a shop, and the lady serving was Miss Cotton. Joan always loved animals, so you can see, you know, this, you wouldn't get away with this now, would you, in a shop with a cat on the counter, and what the lady is measuring up is shortbread. But again, please don't think of it just literally. Just as I think we can read more into the Kyffin than just a landscape, we can read more into the Baker than just a shop interior. Look at the expression on Miss Cotton's face, and she is Miss, and she's not young anymore, and she's weighing things up. You know, perhaps weighing up life there, and there's another female figure in the background. So, you know, do you have the kind of male human condition on the left and the female human condition on the right? Just to pursue that a little bit further, again, another Kyffin and a Joan, another view of Snowdon by him, which again, look at the kind of the palette, and then another painting by Joan. I think you could both legitimately call these landscapes now, although again figures are still quite predominant at this point in Joan's work. No figures in the Kyffin this time because of the scale of the mountains. We have Snowdon in winter, interestingly, and we have Joan in spring. And, you know, judging from their temperaments, you know, winter is an appropriate temperament, I think, underneath it for Kyffin, and spring was definitely a kind of Joan's season. I knew her in her 80s and 90s, and she was always thinking about the next painting, planting the next plant tomorrow. Very, very positive. But what you're seeing in this, so we've established that, you know, this is Kyffin's home territory. in some ways, in the books of Peter Lord and others, North Wales, the mountains, since the Victorian period, was seen as the kind of epitome of the real Wales, which of course I put in inverted commas, what is the real Wales? But if we come then to the Joan, that is also her patch. So it is actually Cardiff. If you can see the crescent moon on the left, that's more or less over where her home was in Cardiff. You have a railway track, so we're looking south, a railway track running into Cardiff. Again, her love of animals, you have the dog that's sort of rummaging in the chip paper. And these sort of anecdotal things. I mentioned possibly with Kyffin, he's thinking in terms of Van Gogh. I think here, perhaps one thinks more someone like Stanley Spencer as an inspiration. But I was talking about their palettes. I think what's important to stress here is, okay, you've got light catching Snowdon, but it's a brooding picture. In the Joan, you almost have like a time lapse because you have sort of the remnants of the night sky on the left of the picture, and then the emphasis is that the light is coming, and it's a flooding light. It's a different light from Kyffin's. And in terms of their palettes, Kyffin used black in his palette. This seems prosaic to say, but it's important. Kyffin used black in his palette, Joan didn't. So technically you've got tints in there. White is the underlying aspect in Joan's work. Black is the underlying one in Kyffin's. So just to focus on them a bit more individually now. So we've got yet another picture, another painting of Snowdon, and again a lone hill farmer with his faithful dog, sheepdog. Kyffin wrote, as I said, because Kyffin was such a raconteur, as David mentioned, I think that's partly is still obscuring the fuller picture of the man and the artist. But there are little glimpses, and in his autobiography, which was written in 1973, there's a quote there for you. So the theme of melancholy, and he repeats the word twice, very briefly, in very short succession. The theme of melancholy is that within most Welshmen. A melancholy that derives from the dark hills, we've already seen that, mountains as well, the heavy clouds and the enveloping sea mists. It's that sense of almost the ominous and the melancholy. If you think of other walks of life, if you think of, especially you could say Dylan Thomas, or if you think of Richard Burton, or who shall we say, Anthony Hopkins, there is that tendency towards excess at times and melancholy. It's sort of perhaps there in the Welsh psyche, which I won't explore any more than saying that at the moment. And that quote I just read to you actually became the basis of an Arts Council exhibition held in North Wales in the late 70s, which was called The Dark Hills, the Heavy Clouds. It included about 8 artists. Kyffin was one of them, and Zaboli was another. More of him later. Just think about that last picture I showed you. Dark, brooding, dramatic, wonderful, powerful North Wales. And then look at the kind of world of Joan Baker to contrast it. This is Ogmore, which of course is also known as Ogmore by sea. The sea, of course, in question here is the Bristol Channel. What I want you to do now in your mind's eye is to imagine now you're looking at Google online and you're looking at a map of Wales. And if you think of the South Wales coastline, it is of course south-facing. If you think of the North Wales coastline, which is Kyffin's coastline, it's north-facing. And because we're in the Northern Hemisphere, when the sun is shining, that is the light source, isn't it, in both these pictures. In South Wales, and because I live in South Wales, I experience it, the Bristol Channel will act as a mirror. So I was doing that, when was it, yesterday or the day before, looking out to the sea, and it reflects so brightly, it's actually blinding at times. So we have this great reflective light that hits the Bristol Channel and comes up onto the coastline. Whereas in North Wales, when the sun is shining, it's bouncing onto the sea, and technically most of that light is bouncing away from you. So it's a kind of a loss of light. And then if you're in Snowdonia and you're looking south, you get silhouetting of the mountains, which you can't do when you're on the South Wales coast, because if you're looking south, you're actually looking across to England, and it's a whole different concept. So we have two types of whales, and I think two temperaments. They're both Joan Baker in the south, Kyffin in the north. They're really ideally suited to be painting in the places they were. I'm even tempted to use the word ecstasy. I think both Kyffin and Joan, in a way, they were both single. I think they did lose They did lose themselves in their work. It's a kind of ecstasy, of stepping outside oneself. And here's the quote. So we had Kyffin's from his autobiography. This is now Joan's from an exhibition. In later years, she was very reticent about exhibiting. She exhibited a lot as a younger woman, but not in older age. Anyway, there was a show of staff from Cardiff Art School, and Joan was persuaded to be one of the exhibitors. So she wrote this: I always choose to work from direct experience and personal observation, trying to realise the ground beneath my feet, the sky above my head, and all that happens to be in between. My most recent work has come about as a result of walking barefoot. I mean, imagine yourselves now walking barefoot on that wet sand over the shore, submitting myself to the translucence, that word translucence, of a breaking wave, the iridescence of wet sand, sunlight on a sheer cliff face. So you can see it is all about that luminosity that the South Wales coast provides. So a different kind of South Wales, a different kind of vision. Back up to the north, here is Kyffin now. So primarily he's a painter of mountains. Joan is primarily a painter of coasts. She does paint other things, so does he, but he also will paint the sea. But look at how he sees the sea. And that word in the title, storm. Again, it's almost, if you think of kind of romanticism and expressionism, it's that isn't just a storm at sea, that's some kind of other storm, perhaps, that's going on. It's tumultuous, isn't it? It is in full tumult. I mean, I wouldn't want to be swimming in that, would you? This is perhaps the point I should mention, of course, that Kyffin suffered from epilepsy. I mean, one of the stories that he told, the way it goes is that he when he was a Welsh Guardsman as a young man, his comrades caused him to drink too much, and it stimulated an epileptic attack, and he had them then for the rest of his life. So you do get this sense in the work, it's sort of carpe diem, it sees the moment, and he did paint incredibly fast. He could produce several, these are all oils, by the way, all the Kyffins I'm showing you, all the Joans are oil paintings. He could produce several in a day, which again, I don't want to overstress that, because, if you think of Van Gogh, he also is painting quite rapidly. That does not mean that Van Gogh or Kyffin are painting without consideration, but that there is this sense of urgency, of rapid execution, and perhaps that things can overwhelm. I mean, Kyffin once said, the reason he didn't get married was he didn't want any children that he might have had to have been epileptic, because it was so bad. And he would have great depressions as well. But again, to be in his company, generally, you were swept along. Again, comparing it to Joan. Back to the so we've come from the North Wales coast back to the South Wales coast. This is high cliff between Marcross and Monknash, to this stretch of coastline that she said she knew since her childhood. I remember again her once saying to me, Ceri, and she was a very Kyffin seemed very extrovert. Joan, if anything, was introvert. Again, it was more complex than that. But she said to me, Ceri, so this was with no kind of sense of bragging. She said, if you drop me on any beach on South Wales coast there, or inland in any location, I'd be able to tell you exactly where I was, because she was a plein air draftsman and painter. She would know the coastlines intimately. I mean, this one, I think that word ecstasy, it comes, it's there in the Kyffin, but it's also here again. I mean, because in a sense, as you look at that, we almost become birds. You know, what symbolises freedom apart from birds? It's kind of vertiginous. She uses that. You know, we had storm with Kyffin, now we have high cliff. And again, you wouldn't be forgiven, I think, of being reminded of Impressionism when you look at her work. Again, remember, the Impressionists were really avant-garde in the 1870s when they started using a palette that didn't involve black, and they optical mixed or kept the colours pure and with a white base. Joan is using that kind of palette. And I don't think I'm stretching it. It does sort of half remind me of some Monets, but to give you the Welsh connection, I don't know if any of you know this, there is a direct Welsh connection between the French Impressionists and South Wales. And that's Alfred Sisley, who was a contemporary of Monet, and he came and painted on the South Wales coast in the 1890s. So you have a kind of a direct lineage there. He stayed in Penarth and painted around that area, and he also stayed just beyond the Mumbles in the start of Gower and painted around that area. It's worth looking up the Welsh Impressionist paintings. Right, so let's move on. So just this on the next slide, looking at Kyffin and Joan, considering them as a certain two types of personality, two types of Wales, and then I'll move on to the second two artists. So yeah, Azalea, thank you for that, David. Yeah. So on the left, again, these are both in Joan's house. And you will recall me saying that I remember her, the fact that, I mean, obviously I wasn't there then, I wasn't there when she was born, but she was born in that house. And she slept in the bedroom that was her parents' bedroom, which she'd been born in, and that's where she died. So this is her house. So that's her bedroom on the right. And on the left is the part of her kitchen. So we're told it's a cold spell, so again this love of nature. Kyffin has a love of rugged nature of the north, and Joan has this perhaps more, she was a tomboy, but you know, in some ways a more delicate or more intimate kind of love of nature. So she's brought in one of her treasured azaleas to protect it from the frost. We're now into the 1990s, so to give an idea of age group, you can probably see the reflection in the mirror in the right-hand picture. This is Joan aged about 75. She's coming up to 75. And look what she calls it. This is something that's really important, actually, is titles. I mean, some artists start with a title and develop the work, other people do the picture and then work out what the title is, but they are telling. So all these titles are the artist's own. The Last Rose, and there it is on the chair, but again, is that the only last rose we see in the picture? She's single, has therefore had no children, and there she is in the window. Her parents are deceased by this time. And it's the only time, and I've looked at hundreds of her pictures, it's the only time she ever did anything approaching a self-portrait, which I think is again revealing of her. She didn't like to be the centre of attention, whereas, you know, Kyffin, certainly on his good days, loved that. I need to give you a quote there, perhaps to contextualise. So this is Joan painting flowers, and again, filled with light. Pictures filled, the interiors now filled with light. I mean, they don't look like Bonnards, but there's a kind of Bonnard feel to that palette. This is her in her 70s, but at the age of 16, she told me, she said, Ceri, I decided at the age of 16 that I had to be one of two things. She was a scholarship girl at Howell School, so it was a bit like Highgate. It was a posh school in Cardiff, Howell School for girls. She'd won a scholarship there. Again, totally understated. I discovered, she didn't tell me, but I pressed her on it. She was the only girl in that year in Glamorgan to win. They awarded two scholarships, one for a girl, one for a boy, and she got the girls' one. So, yeah, she said at 16, I decided I wanted to be a painter who gardened or a gardener who painted. And she certainly became the first. Again, in those days, I mean, Cardiff, like so many places, is very built up now, but she mentioned that when she walked from her house to Howell, she walked past allotments and orchards. It's all houses now. Okay, and the last slide on Kyffin then. So again, I've now reached them in old age. Joan dies in her early 90s, Kyffin in his late 80s. And so we have North Wales again, Dinorwic. Again, remember I was saying to you about the silhouetting against the sky. This is a kind of typical Kyffin characteristic of looking into the light that is hidden behind that silhouette to a certain extent. And it's also true in his self-portrait there. That's him in his studio on Anglesey. The studio was attached to his house in Pwll Van Orgol. Joan's studio was actually one of the rooms in the house. So there he is. Whereas Joan is sort of just lurking quietly in that mirror, and that's the only time she paints herself that I've been able to establish. Kyffin repeatedly did self-portraits, and again, if you think of Van Gogh or whatever artist you want to take, the self-portrait is something that quite a few artists do, but not all of them. And again, it's kind of reflective, isn't it? I'll leave you to decide what the mood is in that Kyffin. Okay. So that's the end of part one. And that's the slightly older generation. Kyffin born in 1918, and Joan born in 1922, just in those early years of the century. So just go forward a tiny bit to Ogwyn Davies. So he's our third artist. He was born in 1925. Joan, as I say, was born in Cardiff. Kyffin was born in, I don't think I said it, in Llangefni, which is in the centre of Anglesey. Ogwyn was born in the upper Swansea Valley in a place called Trebanos. Just down the road from Trebanos is Ystalyfera, which you see in this picture. His wife-to-be was from Ystalyfera. Ogwyn went to school there. And Ogwyn, like Zaboli, came from working class backgrounds. So they were from a different kind of Wales, a different kind of cultural formation. Whereas Joan and Kyffin were wartime art students, Ogwyn and Zaboli, Ogwyn Davies and Ernest Zaboli, were immediate post-war students. So they were students again during that Attlee period. The NHS is in the news all the time now, but it's in that period that the NHS is set up and there are new possibilities. And they would have subscribed to that. I don't actually know, maybe someone else can tell me at the end. I don't know what Kyffin and Joan's politics were, but I can tell you definitely that Ogwyn and Zaboli were definitely left-wing, which again perhaps we associate with Wales, but obviously there is a political spectrum even there. Ogwyn goes on a journey though, as well as an artistic journey, he goes on a political journey, so he actually moves from there. But certainly at this time, he was the son of a tin plate worker who worked in this area, in Ystalyfera. I've been dealing, all the artists are deceased, I think I may or may not have mentioned that. So to recap for you, Ogwyn Davies died in 2015, going back a bit, Joan in 2017, so she was the longest liver. Kyffin in 2006 and Zaboli in 1999. So even though I met them, I can't ask them all the extra questions I'd like to have asked them. But I'm in touch with Ogwyn's son and daughter, and so far between us, we haven't been able to establish whose funeral this is, but it will, we think, be a specific funeral. And I don't know if you spotted the coffin yet. It's in the distance, and it's broadside on, down the kind of the path. Again, at this time, I don't know what it was like in England in the 50s, but certainly, I know for a fact in Wales, and in some parts of Wales this is still observed, only men go to the cemetery. But certainly then, the women didn't, just the men. If you notice, it's all men. Again, we notice how that one little cross breaks cover, as it were, against the dark tree. And then look at the trees. Again, if you want to read some symbolism into it, you have the evergreen trees, but also the dead trees. So, there's this kind of, Ogwyn was religious, the idea of birth, death, resurrection. Perhaps that's hinted at here, but the tantalizing bit, maybe eventually, there's someone in the audience that I'm now corresponding with to see if we can identify whose funeral this might have been. But I think that the important things is that here we have Ogwyn, the landscape painter, the man from South Wales, the man from an industrial background. So probably these were mostly industrial workers. We're beginning to build up a kind of picture, but probably some of you in the audience may have actually identified it. When I saw this picture, a famous painting came into my mind immediately, and that was Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow. The composition is very similar. Now, the danger of a biographer, of course, is to impose all kinds of things on one's subject. But I held that in my mind, and I was so delighted when I was going through Ogwyn's papers that were provided to me by his son and daughter, that there was a reference that it was that. He was thinking about Bruegel, and that painting in particular. So already, and it'll be the same with Zeboli as we see, perhaps there's a popular perception at times, certainly there was in the past, that Wales was a backwater, a cultural backwater, and yet you've already seen how all the artists I've been mentioning, they are all very much aware of what is happening across the UK and of artists from other countries. So they are definitely outward looking rather than just narrowly focused. So you have that kind of mix going on in their work. I'll pick up on that thread a bit more in a moment. So now we move to Zeboli, our final artist, and again I'm going to do some comparison between these slightly younger two artists. Italian origin, as I mentioned. One of those shops in the background, the one where there's a man with two dogs, that shop to the right of him, the sort of palish green shop, was actually run by Italian Welsh. It was one of the cafes in the Rhondda. Ystrad Rhondda is a different part of the South Wales coalfield to Ogwyn's. It's very interesting because in South Wales, even now we talk about them as the South Wales valleys, but of course to be the valleys you need mountains. We talked about Kyffin's mountains, but the artists tend to look at the valleys more so, and they're not as high, of course, as Snowdonia. So we had that valley of Ystalyfera, which is a much broader valley in South Wales than where Zeboli lives. As you move, you track from east to west across South Wales. Again, imagine doing that in your mind's eye. The types of coal change across South Wales, but also the folding of the valleys. So the valleys of Zeboli are narrower and deeper, and the mountains are higher. And when you go further west, they become not as high, and the valley opens up more. So perhaps not surprisingly, Zeboli's representation of that his South Wales is different from Ogwyn's. And you can see here, I don't know if you know, just think about the amount of sky you're seeing. Whilst I'm up here in London, I'm staying with a close friend who's in the room as well, who's Kent born and bred and lives there, and I'm amazed at these huge skies. It reminds me of sort of Dutch painting. You have these flat landscapes and huge skies, which, growing up in London, as a small boy, I was aware of, even as a school age, I loved the large architecture, the grand architecture of London. And then when I went to Wales to relatives, you had the architecture of the mountains. But it meant a slightly reduced skyline. So Zeboli it isn't just a mannerism, it really is about experience. So look, you just have a little glimpse of the sky, and you've probably noticed those three dark bumps. That's a coal tip. After Aberfan, a lot of the coal tips were cleared, but at this time, this is nearly 10 years before Aberfan, they were very much there. The mountain that it's perched on is called, that lovely word, Llwyn-y-Pia Mountain, and the coal tip is known as Nant y Gwyddon coal tip. And this is Zeboli. He's born in 1927, so he's about 30 painting this. It becomes a leitmotif, a visual leitmotif, a repeating motif. And I'd like to liken it seems a bit fanciful. Again, if you go back to the kind of French Impressionists, think of Paul Cézanne. And, so for Kyffin, his is Snowdonia, this Eryri. For Cézanne, it's Mont Sainte-Victoire, isn't it? Which he becomes obsessed by. And for Zeboli, it's an industrialized mountain. It's Llwyn-y-Pia mountain with the bumpy coal tip. And I want you to remember those shapes at the top. And then you have the bustle in the street below. That kind of Rhondda community. Okay, so I'll start comparing them a bit more now. So, as I've mentioned, both began in industrialised South Wales, but Zeboli painted that painting at 30. Ogwyn, when he was 30, which would have been in 1955, having taught in England for a few years, 2-3 years, he just was this is a very Welsh characteristic. He had to return to Wales. Bearing in mind he was Welsh speaking. He was first language Welsh. His wife, by the way, was Welsh born but English speaking. But he was desperate, it was the hiraeth, this longing to return home. And he applied for a job, he saw it listed in Mid Wales, in Tregaron. So at 30, he went there. The other thing to say at this point is, of course, we know that Kyffin taught here for nearly 30 years. Ogwyn taught at Tregaron, a school there, for nearly 30 years. Zeboli taught for a similar amount of time, and Joan taught for longer, over 40 years. So all these painters, to supplement their passion, were teaching. And it was really, although Ogwyn is South Wales, he becomes a Mid Wales person, and this is the beginning of his journey, which isn't just artistic, it's also political. It's the beginning of a transition that will see him move from being socialist to being Plaid Cymru, a different kind of persuasion. In a way, this is Art UK. It didn't have the full range. The book gives you a much greater range. So what I'm not able to show you is Ogwyn painting rural, much more obviously rural, rather than sort of slightly dusky, Cardiganshire, farms, luminosity, because again, it's not enclosed like Kyffin's mountains or Zeboli's valleys. It's quite an open area, but it's largely rural and agricultural. So it is a different Wales. It's not about coal mining. It's not about going up Snowdon. It's about rural Wales. And the Wales that Ogwyn discovered in the 50s, in Tregaron, was even more Welsh-speaking than his semi-anglicised South Wales Valley of Swansea Valley. So he calls it Cardiganshire Road November. So this is a typical sort of grey November day in Wales, but there are lots of summary pictures which Art UK unfortunately doesn't show, but they are in the book. Again, talking about this reduced, in a sense, Ogwyn has actually kept quite a reduced amount of sky, not quite as reduced as Zeboli's, but look what Zeboli does in the other one. He completely, obviously the line of vision is different, but there is no sky in it. But you'd be forgiven, wouldn't you, for thinking that's probably nighttime, and it isn't, it's probably daytime. Because, my father was from the Rhondda, like Zeboli, and, being taken up there from a child onwards, I couldn't quite get my head, because it was different from my landscape of London. Your landscapes of London was, on a bright summer's day, if you're in the bottom of the valley, which this is, you're in mountain shadow. So they had to turn the lights on earlier. So I think painters are always going to be very interested in light, whether you're a Welsh artist or from elsewhere. And what has emerged for me is Zeboli's sense of light is different from that reflective mirroring of sunlight off the Bristol Channel that Joan has. It's different from the silhouetting light on the mountains of Snowdonia. It's about light in a very urbanised, deep valley where electricity becomes significant. And one thing to mention here for you all, of course, is the advent of electricity. Electricity is coming to the South Wales valleys around the time Zeboli is born. My father was born the year before him, and my father related as a boy, he'd be working at the table in the house, as they both went to grammar school, lit by an oil lamp. And they remember that transition into electricity. So I think electricity, the electrical light, not because of just the practical thing, you're living in mountain shadow, it was a kind of a wondrous thing, which we can't really, can we, appreciate because we've grown up with electricity. One other thing, I will go back just 1 second, because there is one other thing. Talking about this fact that the Welsh are by no means narrow and inward-looking, they are international as well. Obviously, I've said that Zeboli's parents are Italian, But I've studied this composition really hard. I don't know if while I've been talking, have you spotted the two dogs? Or just one? But there are two there. One in the middle that's cocking its leg up, which very conveniently, if we're looking in terms of composition, divides the picture in half, and one at the bottom looking up into the picture. And Zeboli is beginning, if you compare him to Ogwyn at this point, he's more adventurous, formally speaking. Whereas you have kind of conventional perspective still in Ogwyn's work, that will change. You'll start to get this flattening. Look at the pavement in the Zeboli. He starts doing this a bit more and more, and he comes up to London and sees the Picasso exhibition at the Tate in 1960, and that's a revelation for him of this playing around with perspective. But the other thing was these two dogs. I thought, why has he given up so much space for the dogs? And the way I talk about it in my book, which is out of print, I'm sorry, my book on Zeboli, I'm trying to negotiate with the publisher to do a reprint with an expanded version. I know a few of you have managed to find the book on, dare I mention, Amazon or Abe Books, other outlets are available. I did talk about it at some length there, but I had a kind of a light bulb moment. If you look at the lamp, can you see the lamp with that sort of curling lamppost around the head? And suddenly I made connections, because, again, when I was researching Zeboli, he and his fellow artists, who were known as the Rhondda Group in Cardiff Art School, possibly the first artist group in modern Wales, they, amongst other things, were obsessed by the films. I mentioned French painters, but they loved the films of Jacques Tati. And if any of you have seen Mon Oncle, which came out in 1958, there is a scene where the hapless uncle, played by Tati himself, is getting in all kinds of trouble, and his sister and brother-in-law are in the windows of this modernist house, and the house has circular windows and they're looking out. So here you have that circular motif with the head looking out, and then I thought about the beginning of the film, and if you watch the start of the film, and in fact there's a motif running right through, the film starts with an aerial shot like this, so you're looking down onto the ground from an upper window, you're looking down, so that does flatten the space, and you have the dogs running around. That they start the film, and then little boys running around. So it sort of begins with this notion of freedom represented by the dogs. They will cock their lid up where they want, won't they? The freedom represented by children, and then you have this juxtaposition of the old and the new in the film. And in a sense, that's what's happening in the Rhondda. You have this mixture of artistic freedom, or going down the conventional route in working in the mines. Well, Zeboli wasn't going to do that. So I think there is a reference here to Tati, whose work I absolutely adore. It's very visual, isn't it, rather than verbal. It's visually based. Talking about sort of visual verbal, we now switch back to Ogwyn. I mentioned he was Welsh speaking, and he does this series, My Hen Rad Fy Nhadau, literally the land of my, well, it's literally the old land of my fathers, the Welsh national anthem. And the first one he produces is this one, which dates to the mid-70s. This is owned by the National Museum. Virtually everything I'm showing you is owned by major public collections in Wales. Not in England, but in Wales. So we've got a job still to do there. And I've talked about Impressionists and others, but now if you think of, say, the Surrealists and this whole idea of automatic writing, if you think of Dali, and all the kind of the classic Nero, the Surrealists, I think that's what's going here. It's almost kind of an automatic writing. So to unpack this for you, I put a quote in there. Again, these are Ogwyn's own words. So there's several levels to this image. And one is him hearing thousands of, mainly male, but not exclusively, voices singing the national anthem in Cardiff Arms Park. It didn't go well, did it, a few days ago? And how moved he was by that. He was a very emotional kind of person, Ogwyn, in a different way, I think, from Kyffin and Joan. So he remembered one day, as he says there, that he and again, this is the technique, the convention is to have a painting on an easel, and Kyffin and Joan are easel painters, and Zeboli is, but Ogwyn was a bit different. Sometimes he would work flat. I mean, someone like Jackson Pollock, starts that process of actually painting with something on the floor. So he had this board laid flat, and he had this sort of mixture of material, sandy mixture. And he just sort of, almost like automatic writing, started writing into it the national anthem. So it was a kind of memory of hearing those words in the rugby stadium. And then he mentions that 18 years later he comes back to it and he combines more material. And to make it really Welsh, the material he uses is literally from Wales. So we have different earths of Wales, the coal dust, the stone dust, the sand, all those kind of things. And the series becomes more colourful. In some you can recognise, here you could almost not recognise the words. It looks ancient, which is no accident, because as I was telling someone, I think today or yesterday, Wales is the European, may I call it that, the European country with the oldest living language and the youngest capital. So it's that sense that Wales is an ancient language, and even though it gets battered and worn, somehow it survives. And again, to give you the European context, more broadly, what triggered him to work in this way was this new way. So look how different from his oil painting. In fact, if I backtrack, when he was a student, or applying to be a student, he was going to do, remember I said his father was a tin plate worker, he was going to do chemistry and metallurgy at Swansea Uni, and he came down on the bus to Swansea, arrived early, and he said, I need to kill some time. So he went into the Glyn Gallery and met an art student who he knew, who was from Ystad and he said, the art school is across the road, so he went over that, and Ogwyn never turned up for his interview for chemistry and metallurgy. That's how he started art. So his two favourite subjects, when I talked to him, were chemistry and art at school. They were his best subjects. So he always loved material. So I think latent in him was this desperation, not just to use paint, but to use any material. And it begins to surface. And it did. What gave him that permission to do it? Because that is extremely daring work. If you're talking about the avant-garde in Britain, that's right up there in the 1970s, whether you're British or British Welsh, British English, whatever. He'd seen an exhibition of Antoni Tapies, so the Catalan artist, which had kind of resonances for him, Catalonia and its fight, and then the Welsh with its language. Antoni Tapies, I don't know why, it was a Hayward Gallery exhibition from here in London, and the only venue it went to outside London was Swansea, and he just happened to see it there the year before. And it gave him the permission. He thought, well, yes, because I don't know if you know Tapies' work, but look it up. Tapies is again very experimental with his use of materials. So just a few more slides now. I mentioned Tapies. In a sense, with this Zeboli, it isn't just Ogwyn connecting to continental Europe. We now have Zeboli having both a local and a global vision in this painting. Zeboli retired early the year before. He was in his later 50s. So I think he felt that this gave him license to again work more freely than he did it earlier on. He calls this interior number 3, which seems like a banal enough title, but if you start looking at it, and again, we always seem to have animals, don't we? There's an animal there you can just glimpse, but I don't know if you can see a female figure ghosting her way across the middle of the picture. And then if you look out of the windows, can you see that you actually have two suns in the picture? Top left, you have a larger sun, which is the rising sun at the bottom end of the valley. And then at the right, you have a smaller sun, which is the setting sun towards the top of the valley. And if you look at that top end, do you recognize the coal tip profile on the hill? You need to look at dozens of Zebolis to sort of see how his Mont Saint-Victoire, which is a coal tip on a mountain, is used again and again. But I said it's local and global. This is his house, so it couldn't be more local than that. And that is his wife ghosting from the kitchen into the passageway and towards this. So from the morning kitchen with the breakfast laid out, through the passageway to the evening sitting room. Can you see there's a newspaper on the table? It's difficult, you can't really read it, but this is a very big painting. It's actually larger than you're seeing it on the screen. And I'll tell you what it is. the red top, it's a red top, it's Morning Star, it's the Morning Star paper, and the subheading is Never Again. And again, I think often art historians, biographers, I know there are biographers in the room as well, we have to be detectives. But of course, again, the date, remember I gave you the example of Bruegel's Hunter in the Snow, hopefully you actually find what you arrive at from the source material rather than imposing what you think upon the material. So it took me ages. I don't know if, I'm not going to ask you for an answer, but have a think about, well, what would this heading, 1985, and this heading, Never Again, on a newspaper. Morning Star, of course, the communist paper. He took two newspapers, he took the Morning Star and the Guardian, and he would never talk about that when he was teaching. He finished teaching the previous year. And I think the fact that he was of Italian origin, his father had been interned during the Second World War. I mean, all Italians of working age were. So even though he was known, his father had a corner shop, he was known, but it was very tricky. I'd assumed it was to do with the miners' strike, which was 84 to 5, so I thought Never Again, because this is the period that the acceleration of deindustrialisation in South Wales, the closing of pits, happens. But it isn't. And eventually I managed to identify it, and I thought, it is an anniversary in 1985, but not of the miners' strike, it's an anniversary. Remember I said this painting is local, this is Ernie Zaboli in his wife's own house in the Rhondda, and you see the valley behind, morning to evening. There's time-lapse going on in the picture. Think about time-lapse. It's the 40th anniversary of Hiroshima. That's what Never Again is standing for. And it's that period, I'm old enough, hopefully some of you are as well, to remember the kind of worry of nuclear threat in the UK in the 80s. And if I tell you that Zaboli's wife, Christine, she was one of the Green and Common women that went to London from the valleys and was part of that mission. So there was this sort of fear, wasn't there? I remember reading about Dylan Thomas and one of his famous poems. I think I'm right to say it's Fern Hill. And he frustrated the publishers, and this was nothing to do with laziness, this was to do actually with the exact opposite of that, attention to detail. He delayed completing that. It was being published by Dent, I think in early 50s. And the reason he was delaying it, he was waiting really till war ended to complete the poem. And there's a line in there which talks about the shadow of a hand. And basically that was a result of Dylan seeing the photos of Hiroshima and of demolished walls. And there was this apparent shadow of a hand on a wall, but actually it's horrific. It's a vaporized hand, and that's all that's left, is that on the wall. And if you look at this picture, you may start to realize actually things are vaporizing. If you look at it, the walls are melting. The figure is melting. There was this genuine fear, Raymond Briggs, When the Wind Blows, all that, it's all there. So, Wales is local, but it's also global in its sensibility. Right, comparisons then, going back to their leitmotifs. I've talked about Zaboli's one, which, and we have that kind of, it's a slightly more abstracted version of it at the top of the picture. And it's a very warm palette. They're both winter pictures. I'm going to end with a set of winter pictures as well, just as a kind of a farewell, a sort of a close of the bookend. In the case of Ogwyn, in mid-Wales, they often had snows. And this was the view, so again, quite personal, this is the view from the back of his house. By the way, Ogwyn had his house built by the leading modernist architect in Wales. And it was a design classic, and the children, son and daughter, were very sad when they had to reluctantly sell the house. I went to it, it was beautiful. That kind of flat roof modernism, white walls, a sort of Le Corbusier sort of style, designed by a Penarth architect. So this was the view out of the back of the house, and it was idyllic. The garden ran down to the river, where Ogwyn could catch salmon. His wife had, a little garden of Eden, or a big garden of Eden with beautiful plants and trees. And then the hillside rose up at the back, which then Generally, it's a wide open valley, but at this angle, because the mountain rises up again, it produces a reduced skyline, and he often would see the ravens. As you probably know, say, from the Tower of London, the ravens are the largest of the corvids, but they're incredibly acrobatic. So he's looking at the acrobatics, and this is a very personal view. It's kind of poetic, and maybe even, there's a kind of spiritual feel to that work. Bear in mind, he was a chapel goer, his wife was church. But, Zeboli wasn't, I suppose he and his wife used to carry around Chairman Mao's little red book at times, so they weren't churchgoers. They'd had a church wedding, but that was about it. But, his interpretation of the valleys is very different. And in this case, although it's December, it's very warm. I feel, at this point, I don't know if you know the work of Kittai, contemporary of Hockney, but in the late 70s, he's working in this kind of way, and there's certain parallels between Zeboli and Kittai's work at the time. But I think it's almost like an alternative to a nativity. If you look very closely, there is a chapel in the middle there. There's three little, what are the right yellow windows of a chapel by that white section of road, and you've got some sheep. There you are. Had to get some sheep in. And then a figure bottom left. So there's kind of a hint of the nativity, but what struck me looking at it was something he'd written in 1963. He'd actually got his first teaching job on Anglesey, so he was in sort of Kyffin territory, and he couldn't cope with living in Llangefni. By the way, there's an exhibition coming up there which I'm going to be involved with in Llangefni, which is another project which you can ask me about afterwards if you wish. The way Zeboli described Llangefni was, it was all wind and chapel. He wasn't a chapel goer himself, and he wasn't really being derogatory, but he felt like a fish out of water because Zeboli was not. He had some Italian, mostly English, didn't speak Welsh, and it was very Welsh in the 50s. And the other thing he said was, the mountains are too distant from Llangefni. They look like a picture postcard. See little shapes in the distance. He wanted them closer. So when he returned, he didn't stay in Llangefni long. He returned to teach in the valley, in the Rhondda, and then he got a teaching job in Newport Art School for many years, in South Wales. And this is what he said. When he returned to the Rhondda, it was like getting back into a warm bed. Again, what a lovely image, I'm sure we all enjoy getting back into a warm bed. And I think of this picture, it's almost, I feel, as if, perhaps his head is down the bottom there, and he's looking at the blankets, and he's underneath all that lovely warmth. So, Rhondda was his beloved Rhondda, just as Snowdon was a beloved place, just as the coast was a beloved place for the other artists, and Mid Wales for Ogwyn. This is the cover of the book. The reason I'm showing you that, because again, Art UK doesn't show the picture that's in the middle there. And this is another aspect of Wales, of course, that Ogwyn covers as a religious man. He's the religious one out of these four artists. He's the one that goes to church and chapel. And what you see there, he's in his studio, which was very organised. Zeboli's was more chaotic, as was Kyffin's. Jones was pretty organised. On there is the chapel of Soar y Mynydd, which is a very, very beautiful ancient Welsh chapel. And in reality, can you see the reduced skyline? That is a caprice. In reality, the mountain behind is, you can only just glimpse it over the roof of the chapel. And he did several versions, and he's risen the skyline because he wants this idea of the spirit rising. Now, this isn't fanciful on my part, again, it's based on research. What I discovered was he'd been out having a picnic with his wife and friends near Soar y Mynydd in rural Ceredigion, Cardiganshire as it was, and a service was underway. It was summertime, the windows were open, and I think it's a kind of case of synesthesia. Ogwyn said he could see the words of the hymns coming out of the building and sticking to the walls and the hills. And so you can't really see it there, I'm sorry it's not a close-up, but on the hills there he's got the lyrics from hymns, but he's also got the musical notations. And this became a whole series that he did over a number of years, and it's his best-selling work. If we think of Van Gogh, it's sunflowers. If we think of Ogwyn, it's So Ar y Mynydd. But of course, artists are much more than one work. Back to this journey that Ogwyn went on. He starts titling his works either bilingually or exclusively in Welsh. This is called Wal Gymreig in Welsh. You've got the English Welsh wall. Remember the idea of he felt he had license through the Catalonian artist Tapies to experiment with surfaces and textures and new ways of doing pictures. And this is one example. And one of the inspirations was sort of graffiti art and protest art in Wales. So there's a whole jumble of letters there. But if you see the large red letters, that's going to be the word either Cymru, meaning Wales, or Cymraeg, meaning Welsh. And we've also got, just under the name Redwood, which I'll come back to, just above it we've got a fraction of the word Tryweryn, which is a reference to Cofio Tryweryn. So this is the small Welsh-speaking village that virtually all Welsh MPs voted against being flooded for water for Liverpool, and yet it happened, and it mobilised kind of the language movement because the Welsh seem to be powerless in their own land. Redwood. The Redwood actually says Redwood dos Adre. This is Welsh, so the translation of that is Redwood go home. And this is a reference to John Redwood, who at one point was Secretary of State for Wales. You've probably seen the video clips of him trying to sing the Welsh national anthem. But the reason that Ogwyn and others were saying this, that Redwood should go home, is in his penultimate year as Secretary of State for Wales, he was delighted to be able to inform Mrs. Thatcher that he was returning a large sum, millions, back to the Treasury because he'd succeeded in underspending on development in Wales. So Ogwyn is becoming quite politicised by this time. Although Zaboli, had been a communist and probably shifted more, after the kind of problems with Maoist China, he's no longer a communist, he's just a socialist. But apart from that one painting with the Morning Star on it, he doesn't really deal. Politics is not his area. But what he begins to develop, so we now go to them in old age, these two artists in their final years, his development, he isn't playing around with materials and styles of art as much as Ogwyn, as concentrating on where he is in the valley and what he is, a painter. So here we have him. Again, it's rather prosaically called Painter and Surroundings. But he decides, we had the flattening effect of the snow. Zaboli, I think he must have suffered from insomnia, but in retirement, he certainly used to walk the dog at night. I'm not quite sure why, whether he bumped into fewer people. He was getting quite obsessed and spending a lot of time in the studio. And night becomes his kind of, think of the Whistler's Nocturnes of the Thames. Other artists who've used the night. Night becomes, his pictures are all nighttime at the end. In the 90s, nearly all of them in the 90s, his last decade, they're not daytime anymore. So here he is. If you look carefully, can you see that you've actually got now a horizon, a skyline, down the left and right-hand margins? But again, if you imagine he is in the valley, so if you imagine, like with my hands here, think of a book. If this is the valley and you're down here, the top edges of the book are your two skylines. So it's the skyline either side of the valley, and there you have the river, Rhondda, snaking its way down. So down at the bottom of the picture will be towards Cardiff. You have also the dual carriageway now that have been built on the site of the railway. And there he is. So this world is whizzing around him. The street lights are on. There's the road and the river, and there he is at his easel. In a fanciful way, perhaps I did get a bit fanciful here, I see this as the lone painter, as conjurer, as tightrope walker, looking sort of tightrope walking on the edge of the silhouette of his house in red. He's just balancing things. He's a magician. Is he Prospero? Is this magic realism? It's certainly innovative. And Ogwyn goes even further. This is a painting with a Welsh-only title, Gwynllan a Roddwyd, which loosely translates and it is very loosely, as Wales is a vineyard. It's based on a Saunders-Lewis play written in the 30s. Lewis, with 2 other people, were actually imprisoned for setting an RAF camp on fire in North Wales. One of them was a reverend. He became a bit of a hero for a younger generation in the 60s, partly because of Tryweryn and the drowning of the valley for a reservoir. Saunders-Lewis, in old age, in 1962, gave a notorious but also a very famous and popular talk on the radio, BBC Wales Radio, which in English is translated as The Fate of the Language, Tynged y Iaith in Welsh. The idea that if something urgently and extremely, if there wasn't extreme urgent action, the Welsh language was going to die. And this text refers to that early play, which is kind of critical of the kind of English domination of Wales as its bigger partner. That Wales was a vineyard and it could be despoiled by others. The exact, notice the date, 1999, that is significant because this picture was done as a tentative work for the new Welsh Assembly building. It hasn't been used, it's been exhibited, but it hasn't actually been used because it is quite controversial. Okay, the last image of an individual, and then I'll say some closing remarks. I was saying how Zeboli then makes him sound like Phantom of the Opera. He's embracing the night. But yeah, another night picture. And this one, which again, he tends to use these rather straightforward titles, which are almost like descriptions. A painting of myself in a landscape. And if you look carefully now, he's even gone further so that the skyline isn't just up and down each edge. It's now also top and bottom. It's almost the sky, not much of it because you're in that deep valley, but it's literally all around you. And he's beginning to think. I mean, Hockney plays with space, and I think there are certain loose connections between. I mean, Hockney does it in a very different way, but Zeboli is thinking about space, spatial awareness in a picture, and how you perhaps represent that, and how we represent ourselves, whether we're representing Wales or something else. And of course, what he's thinking here is that's a self-portrait, of course, of him with his glasses on, looking out into the picture and out into the landscape. He, of course, when a painter paints a landscape, they are physically, when they're doing it, they're probably in that landscape. You know, Kyffin on the mountain, Zeboli in the valley, they're actually in it. But of course, they're painting it, so they're also outside it. And I think that's the kind of concept that's going on here, which is why you have this scale jump. So this idea that Zeboli is sort of not in the silhouette of his house now, but in the silhouette maybe of a doorway. He's both in the landscape because he's from there, and yet when he's a painter, he's standing back. And these are kind of techniques that filmmakers might use as well. Some people, when I've shown them reproductions of this painting, or the actual painting, which is in the University of South Wales, just north of Cardiff, some people see it as a doorway, some as a mirror, and some as even a coffin. I mean, Zeboli and his wife's health was deteriorating by this point. His wife dies in 97 and he dies in 99. So perhaps there is that sense of, there's an elegiac quality. It's also what I call catastrophic. It's a word that's been used in relation to the writings of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry as an aviator, this idea that when you fly over things, and if you go to the top of the Rhondda mountain, that circle above his head is actually a mountain-top housing development on the top of Penrhys. You feel as if you're almost a bird looking into the valley. And of course, in the mind's eye, because this is a mind's eye picture as well as a real picture, it's again another perhaps example of a form of Welsh magic realism. You are flying over things. You almost are the aviator. I do develop a lot more on this picture in the book and related works. There is even a connection. I mentioned he'd looked at Picasso as a younger adult. At this point, he's travelling to Italy more often. His dream was always to have two homes, one in the Rhondda, one in Italy, but he couldn't afford that, so it just had to be visits. But he went to see the work, for example, of the Sienese painters Lorenzetti, and they played around with perspective. as had Simone Martini, some pre-Renaissance artists who were using perspective in a different way. Okay, so concluding remarks. You've seen some of them, but you haven't seen all of them. So I thought I'd finish rather mischievously really, with Ogwyn top left, Zeboli top right. You can probably recognise who painted which ones. I'm sure you can. So we go from the more open valley of Wales that Ogwyn represents to the more enclosing valley of Zeboli. It's a new one I'm showing you, and you can see the scale of the mountain from the train that almost looks toy-like at the bottom. We go from those kind of visions to Joan's back garden, a painting of her father feeding the birds in the snow, and Kyffin's beloved mountain top with the mountain farmers and the beloved sheep. So all of them, to a certain extent, are using snow as a device, and yet they have distinctive visions, and they're showing us quite different aspects of Wales. Thank you very much.